communist power in the world's biggest empire that set the course for the longest conflict of the 20th century through the state it created and through the impact it had elsewhere. The Bolshevik takeover in Russia came because the empire, a wartime ally of France and Britain, was weakened by the war. As 1917 began, the situation at the front was dismal, with no victory in sight. The liberal opposition was tarnished among the population because of its support of the war. When the Russian monarchy was overthrown in a revolution in March 1917, the influence of the Bolsheviks was limited. But the liberal socialist coalition that came to power after the revolution could not end the war or deal with its catastrophic economic effects. Lenin's slogan, "Land, bread, peace," as well as his popularity among other socialists because of his opposition to the war, increased his political sway. In November 1917, with the provisional government further weakened through infighting, the Bolsheviks pulled off a coup d'etat and took power in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, and Moscow. The October Revolution, which, following the old Russian calendar, was the Bolshevik term for their November coup, began a profound transformation of Russia. In 1918, the Bolsheviks chased out the elected Constitutional Assembly and established the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic. The civil war that followed, between the Bolsheviks' Red Army and a multifaceted anti-Bolshevik White Army, killed 2 million people. The Bolsheviks gradually, and very surprisingly, even to themselves, were able to turn the military tide to their advantage. In 1922, the Russian Soviet Republic became the centerpiece of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics,
As your
USSR,
population level
a
increases,
federation of 16
villages will
republics
grow
carved
into
out from the
towns,
former
enabling the
empire, all
construction of
ruled by the
buildings for
Bolsheviks.
improving income,
Lenin's
happiness,
followers, who now
military,
called
or
themselves
research
communists,
This tab
won the
shows
war
all
because they had
existing
genuine
buildings
support
in the
from the
selected
population,
town or city.
most of whom did not want
Mouse
to go
over
back
them
to the
to see
discredited
what can
old
yet be
imperial
constructed.
state. Liberals and
Right-click on a
socialists, who
picture to
provided
see
many
its
of the leaders
description.
in the struggle against Lenin's
Left-click
coup,
on a building
had to
to add
depend
it
on
to the
Tsarist
queue,
officers for
and
military
again to
support,
remove it.
and that cost them much esteem in the
Construction
eyes
cost
of the
is
population.
displayed underneath.
The
Construction
Bolsheviks
time
coming to
is
power
shown in the
horrified
top
elites in the
left-hand
countries that had been Russia's allies in World War I. To them, the Bolsheviks were a nightmare within a bad dream. Not only did Lenin end Russia's war against Germany, he proclaimed that the supreme aim of his state was revolution in all European countries, preferably by violence, as had happened in Petrograd. The Allies intervened in the Russian Civil War at first to help those non-Bolsheviks who wanted to continue to fight against Germany and Austria-Hungary, but the intervention soon became directed against the Bolshevik regime itself. The foreign forces remained in place after the European war ended in 1918. Their Russian protégés were militarily unreliable and politically weak, and the interventions ultimately had little effect. But they did convince new recruits to the Bolshevik cause that the capitalist world would not hesitate to use arms against them if given a chance. Lenin's regime could now rightly call itself the defender of Russia against foreigners. The end of the war saw the United States as the main economic and political power in the world. It alone held a surplus of credit and industrial supplies. The war also ended with the United States as the world's foremost moral authority in politics. In his 14 points describing American war aims and peace terms, President Wilson had proclaimed that the United States fought for a just world, not simply for national advantage. As a state built on ideas and principles, it stood above mere nation-states. It believed that all competent nations had the right to self-government and to participation in a new world organization, the League of Nations. When the United States intervened against the Bolsheviks in Russia in 1918, it claimed to do so because it would render such aid as may be acceptable to the Russians in the organization of their own self-defense. In reality, US elites were as horror-struck by Lenin's rule as were the Europeans. It was rare to see, either in the press or in Congress, a reference to the communists that did not include terms such as murderers or savages. Wilson himself, more cool-headed, saw the Soviet project as a competing form of internationalism to his own variant. Just as the USSR in the 1920s would give up on immediate revolution in Europe, the United States soon gave up on Wilson's dream of rearranging Europe through the League of Nations. But the isolationism that America is often blamed for in the 1920s and 30s was never a reality. More Americans than ever before went abroad to Europe and elsewhere. The cultural exchange and the exchange in goods and services between America and the rest of the world increased sharply. In Europe, Asia and Latin America, US consumer products were all the rage. Cars, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, radios and films did more to transform families and societies than did most political projects. Even in an era dominated by high tariffs and import restrictions, US foreign trade and investment increased sharply. From the 1920s on, the financial center of the world moved from Great Britain to the United States, from London to Wall Street. Nowhere was this increased US influence more striking than in Europe. For centuries, European elites had been the arbiters of global taste and purpose. In Russia, in America, and in the colonized world, the ideal of the English gentleman or the learned French philosophe ruled. But in the interwar years, America brought change to Europe in ways nobody could have foreseen before World War I. US ways of conducting business replaced old European traditions on crucial matters such as management styles and accounting methods, and also, though more gradually, principles of investment. In factories, the assembly line, pioneered by Henry Ford in Detroit, objectified output and linked man and machine. Fordism, meaning synchronization, precision and specialization in production, also spread to other spheres of life, and the technological approach to organization was taken up not just by Western European liberals, but by fascists, Nazis and Soviet communists. But the Americanization of Europe went further than the assembly line in advanced production. Attitudes and ideals were also gradually changing. The concept of holding a job with regular hours and regular pay was foreign to most Europeans at the turn of the century. Even for those who worked in industry, older, more paternalistic mores applied, as did rules set by guilds or hometown associations. Aristocrats never held a job, of course, but neither did the peasants and labourers over whom they lorded. Europe had been changing in this sense for a very long time. But the Americanization of the post-1918 era capped the turn toward a market economy with distinctive US characteristics. The rapid change created by war and its effects gave rise to an extraordinary climate of fear among many people in Europe and elsewhere. The most destructive of these fears centered on individual or national humiliation and destitution. It was claimed that radicals, Jews, capitalists, communists, or neighboring states were out to exploit those who had already suffered and sacrificed in the Great War and its aftermath. In Europe, the fear gave rise to nationalist authoritarian movements such as fascism and Nazism, but it also created new forms of anti-revolutionary thinking that focused on the threat that communism and the Russian Revolution posed to religion. Individual liberty and social advancement through self-improvement. In the United States, the Red Scare of 1919-20 led to arrests and deportations of suspected radicals, restrictions on the freedom of speech, and federal assistance for employers to break strikes and workers' protests. In 1920, Seattle's mayor, Ola Hansen, embodied the scare. With syndicalism, and its youngest child, Bolshevism, thrive murder, rape, pillage, arson, free love, poverty, want, starvation, filth, slavery, autocracy, suppression, sorrow, and hell on earth. It is a class government of the unable, the unfit, the untrained, of the scum of the dregs, of the cruel and of the failures. Freedom disappears, liberty emigrates, universal suffrage is abolished, progress ceases, manhood and womanhood are destroyed, decency and fair dealing are forgotten, and a militant minority, great only in their self-conceit, reincarnate under the dictatorship of the proletariat, a greater tyranny than ever existed under Tsar, Emperor or Potentate. In the United States and Britain, liberalism split under the pressure of war and radical challenges. In ways similar to what would happen after World War II, many liberals joined with conservatives in a wave of anti-revolutionary activism. Winston Churchill, in 1920, still a Liberal Member of Parliament, said, "In every city there are small bands of eager men and women, watching with hungry eyes any chance to make a general overturn, in the hopes of profiting themselves in the confusion, and these miscreants are fed by Bolshevist money. They are ceaselessly endeavoring, by propagating the doctrines of communism, by preaching violent revolution, by inflaming discontent to infect us with their disease." Only a few liberal skeptics remained. While criticizing the methods the Bolsheviks used, the philosopher Bertrand Russell believed that The heroism of Russia has fired men's hopes. For Russell, in the early years of the Russian Revolution, the possibility for a better world explained its attractiveness. In the interwar years, many people felt a great betrayal. Instead of the good life, their country's elites had given them war. Instead of increased opportunity, they got unemployment and more exploitation. In the colonies, many local leaders concluded that the war and the subsequent economic crises proved that the Europeans only cared about themselves, not about progress for those they ruled overseas. Soviet communism seemed a viable alternative to war, destitution and oppression. The new Communist International Organization, Third International or the Comintern, set up by Lenin in 1919, included brand new communist parties in many countries, constructed after the Bolshevik model. It defined national communist parties simply as branches of the Comintern under a strong, centralized Soviet leadership. Ho Chi Minh, the Vietnamese anti-colonial activist who would eventually lead North Vietnam, wrote, "At first, patriotism, not yet communism, led me to have confidence in Lenin, in the Third International. Step by step, along the struggle, by studying Marxism-Leninism parallel with participation in practical activities, I gradually came upon the fact that only socialism and communism can liberate the oppressed nations and the working people throughout the world from slavery." The voice of communist revolution, wrote the Norwegian poet Rudolf Nilsen, called out to burning hearts everywhere. "Yes, give me the best from amongst you, and I shall give you all. No one can know till victory is mine how much to us shall fall. Maybe it means we shall save our earth. To the best goes out my call." The call of the Comintern was heard throughout a world that was tired of war and colonial oppression. Most communist parties began small and formed alliances with other, larger movements. For example, the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, founded in 1921, worked with the Kuomintang, the National People's Party, a much bigger nationalist group founded in 1919 by the physician and revolutionary Sun Yat-sen. In Iran, where an ill-fated Soviet republic had been set up in the north in 1920, the Communist Party was forced underground, where its members concentrated on setting up trade unions and urban organizations. In South Africa, its Communist Party, also founded in 1921, appealed to all South African workers, organized and unorganized, white and black, to join in promoting the overthrow of the capitalist system, an outlawry of the capitalist class, and the establishment of a commonwealth of workers throughout the world. It later worked within the African National Congress, ANC, and provided many of the leaders in the struggle against apartheid. The Comintern linked all of these parties together and gradually helped turn them into instruments of Soviet foreign policy. But the Communist International had an influence that went beyond just the communist parties themselves. The first global anti-imperial movement, the League Against Imperialism, set up in Brussels in 1927, was, for instance, funded and mostly organized by the Comintern. While dreamers dreamed of a communist revolution that would save the world, Lenin and his successors began constructing socialism in their new state. But the plans went awry almost immediately. Not only did the economy collapse, as wealthy and educated people fled the communist regime and untrained political devotees replaced them, but the Civil War, the war against foreign intervention, and the bloody invasions of Soviet power into former parts of the Russian Empire that had declared themselves independent, all cost the regime dearly. By 1920, it was reduced to confiscating food from peasants to transport to workers in the cities. Lenin's decision the following year to test out market incentives in order to get the economy going again, the so-called New Economic Policy, NEP, was never more than a tactical ploy and was abolished as soon as it had brought immediate results. The low point for the communists was a costly and badly fought war against Poland, in which the USSR lost much territory that used to be part of the Russian Empire to the new Polish state. The Polish victory forestalled Soviet attacks on the Baltic republics of Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, which now solidified their independence. But for the Soviet leaders, the failure of revolution elsewhere in Europe was even worse than the loss of territory for the Soviet state. A core idea behind Lenin's seizure of power in 1917 had been that his revolution would soon be followed by others in more socially and technologically advanced parts of Europe. Together they would form a continent-wide Soviet Union fueled toward a higher stage of modernity by European know-how and Russian resources, including its revolutionary discipline. But there were to be no successful revolutions elsewhere. In Berlin, an uprising of left-wing socialists was crushed in January 1919, and its leaders, Karl Liebknecht among them, were murdered. The Bavarian Soviet Republic lasted a mere 27 days before it was defeated in May 1919 by remnants from the German army in the streets of Munich. In Hungary, the centre of the eastern part of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, the communists held out the longest. But in August 1919, the Hungarian Soviet Republic went down in flames in the face of invading Romanian troops supported by France and Britain. Preoccupied with its own civil war, the USSR could do nothing to help. By the early 1920s, it was clear that no other communist revolutions would follow that in Russia, at least not anytime soon. But the deep enmity of the victorious powers against the Soviet Union would remain. The outlook seemed bleak for Moscow's new rulers. Even so, the communists gradually managed to stabilize the Soviet government, albeit in a different form from what they had first thought. After Lenin's death in 1924, the party organization was led by Joseph Jogashvili, a Georgian communist who called himself Stalin, the man of steel. Born in 1878 in a small town in rural Georgia, Stalin had very little formal education. From the age of 21, he worked for Lenin and his party, specializing in the most dangerous jobs such as bank robberies and occasional assassinations. By 1922, Stalin had become General Secretary of the Communist Party, meaning head of the Central Party administration. 6 years later, he had defeated all his political rivals to become uncontested master of the party and the Soviet state. While doing so, Stalin and his followers had probably saved the government they represented. How did they do this? They could rely on the abundant natural and human resources of the former empire. They had the organizational ability of the Communist Party to use those resources. They employed centralized power and economic and social planning for greater efficiency. Finally, they used terror against enemies, real and imagined. Stalin's aim was a totalitarian society in which everyone followed one will and one set of aims in pursuit of socialist construction. And although he never entirely managed to build such a society, the state that had Stalin as its leader seemed an impressive machine to friends and foes alike. The human cost of Stalin's state building was immense. Lenin had set a bloody pattern by executing at least 100,000 people without any form of judicial process. Most were killed simply because they were class enemies or had worked for the old regime. Lenin had also instituted the one-party dictatorship and intolerance toward any opposition. But Stalin, the man his closest associates called the Vozhd, the boss, took these murderous and anti-democratic principles to genocidal lengths. The campaigns against Trotsky and those who had supported him in the inner-party struggle after Lenin's death set the pattern in the late 1920s. Then came the terrible campaign against kulaks, rich peasants, to exterminate them as a class and thereby ease the transfer of all land into public hands. In the 1930s, millions of innocent Soviet citizens were arrested, imprisoned, deported, or shot. The total figures are hard to estimate. At least 10 million Soviet people were killed by Stalin's regime from the late 1920s up to his death in 1953. 23 million were imprisoned or deported. In addition, at least 3 million died in the Ukrainian famine, which the regime did much to provoke and nothing to prevent. Massacres and executions of Poles, Karelians, Baltic peoples, or peoples of the Caucasus are impossible to estimate in numbers, but are rightly characterized as genocide. The Soviet regime under Stalin was savage to its own people and to other peoples alike, in ways that did nothing to contribute to the economic growth it recorded. How could the Soviet system, based on terror and subjugation, appeal to so many people around the world? The Great Depression provided the opportunity. If it had not been for capitalism doing so very badly, communism would not have won the affection of large numbers of dedicated and intelligent people everywhere. In the eyes of many, capitalism had already produced war and colonial enslavement. After the stock market crash in 1929, it produced poverty too, even in the most advanced industrial economies. The Soviets did not do so well, at least not after the mid-1920s, although the regime managed to survive.
Funds are
But world
deducted
capitalism
from your
was seemingly
treasury at the
intent on
beginning of each
self-destruction in
turn
the 1930s.
to pay for the supplies and wages
In the first
of
3
your
years
troops
after
in
the
field.
crash, world GDP fell by about 15%, and it stagnated after that. Overall capitalism had a very bad run in the first half of the 20th century. It was easy to inflame world opinion against it and in favor of ideals of social justice and defense of local communities, even when such values were presented by thugs and murderers. The Soviet Union was not the only collectivist challenger to liberal capitalism in the interwar years. In Italy, the fascists, headed by Benito Mussolini, claimed that their combination of nationalism and socialism was the way forward. In Munich in 1923, just 4 years after the defeat of the Bavarian Soviet Republic, a young German extremist, Adolf Hitler, tried to grab power on behalf of his Nazi party. Hitler failed at first, but his